Have you ever stopped and noticed just how many countries, big ones, small ones, they're all looking at the year 2030. They've got these incredibly ambitious plans, things like huge economic shifts, massive sustainability goals.
Mhm.
It really does seem like this global focal point. But is this just coincidence? Maybe a natural result of everyone trying to work together? Or is there possibly something deeper, maybe something unstated behind it all?
It is quite remarkable, isn't it, how this single date, 2030, has just sort of popped up as this central axis for strategic planning. Like everywhere. You see it with the big players, the US, China, Germany, but also right down to developing nations. And the official line, well, it often talks about these really noble goals, economic diversification, getting rid of poverty, protecting the planet, good things. But when you start trying to connect the dots, this global alignment around 2030, it does make you wonder, could there be a bigger design here, something more intricate at play?
Well, today, that's exactly what we're doing. We're embarking on a deep dive into all these fascinating ideas swirling around 2030. We want to peel back the layers, try and understand what might really be driving this global focus. We've looked into a lot of information, and it presents, well, not just one story, but multiple narratives about this potentially pivotal year. And just quickly, you can find more explorations like this, really in-depth stuff over on our YouTube channel, Obscura Files. So make sure to subscribe. Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this. So the story we usually hear about 2030, it tends to focus on, nations reacting to 21st century problems, modern challenges. But there are some pretty compelling, maybe provocative perspectives suggesting this isn't actually new at all. In fact, some accounts trace this narrative way back, like 300 years back, to the 18th century.
Yeah, if you try and put this into that kind of broader historical context, this particular perspective, it suggests that a new world was essentially declared back in 1730, apparently after about 7 years of intense preparation. And this declaration, according to these accounts, it supposedly came after they found traces of this huge ancient civilization, possibly a Muslim empire, maybe the greatest one to ever rule the earth. The idea is that these new people, well, they inherited what was left of this really luxurious, advanced ancient society.
Okay, now that's interesting. But here's a really striking claim within that view. It suggests a figure named Benjamin, along with 300 founders, actually put together something called the Vision of 1730. What exactly was this vision? What were they supposedly aiming for?
Well, according to the specific interpretation, their goal was huge. Nothing less than a complete historical reset. We're talking erasing, falsifying history, even burning genuine historical records, rewriting everything from the viewpoint of a single secular state. It's a pretty radical theory of historical revisionism, you have to say. Now, the idea of one unified nation wasn't totally new. These narratives say the first human era was also unified. But this view really emphasizes a deliberate act of rewriting history. It also talks about a highly advanced empire called Tartaria, emerging later. Proponents claim it once dominated the entire world from Greater Asia, controlling lands even west of the sun, what we now call Europe. Some accounts even argue the name Europe didn't exist back then, claiming old maps, Italian, French, Dutch, Hungarian, showed this other history up until 1730.
Right, and this is where the alleged deception really kicked in, leading to what got called the Age of Enlightenment. But this perspective claims that period actually twisted meanings, inverted concepts, all to hide the truth. So over these 300 years, the argument goes, there was this systematic attack on religion, faith, traditional values, established facts. How? How was this supposedly done?
This narrative suggests a few key methods. Manipulating big events, like revolutions, using the French Revolution, for example, with stories like Antoinette and the Cake as a kind of cover for deeper hidden motives. It also claims that science itself was sort of twisted to push atheism, saying humans came only from apes, or even suggesting things like dinosaurs were just made up to support evolution. Claims this view calls unproven, serving a specific purpose. And finally, to really cement this new era, they supposedly burned entire cities, just wiped them out to hide any remaining traces of that older, great civilization. What little survived was apparently called the Last Kingdom of Sami.
Okay, so fast forward 300 years from that supposed vision of 1730, and here we are today. This alternative history suggests that the final vision, the one for 2030, was then launched, purportedly by the United Nations, or as some call it, the United World, maybe at a forum in Davos, which this narrative labels the True Ruler Forum. All right, let's shift gears a bit. Moving away from that, let's call it provocative historical take. What is the official modern story about 2030? because we have definitely seen over the last couple of decades this explosion of national plans, often literally called Vision 2030. From the big economies to emerging nations, everyone seems to have one. And it lines up perfectly with the United Nations 2030 agenda, right? Which is presented as this global mission to end poverty, protect the earth, ensure peace, prosperity, all the good stuff.
Exactly. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that's really the public cornerstone of this narrative. And it's incredibly comprehensive. You've got the 17 main Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and then 169 associated targets. They're all meant to be integrated. You can't separate them. And the UN is very clear. This agenda is a plan of action. It applies to everyone on Earth. And crucially, they say it will transform our world completely.
The language is, well, it's incredibly idealistic, isn't it? Almost utopian. A world with no extreme poverty or hunger, everyone healthy, educated, with clean energy, safe water, humanity living in harmony, tackling climate change, protecting biodiversity, peaceful, just society, strong institutions. I mean, it sounds like the perfect blueprint for humanity, doesn't it?
It does. And that's precisely the language that makes some Western skeptics, well, pause. They start asking why. Why use such incredibly idealistic terms? Could it be, they wonder, a deliberate way to mask a more, let's say, pragmatic or even manipulative agenda? The sheer scale of it all, the universality, the breadth of these UN goals. Some see that as an attempt to gain control over basically all aspects of human life and national governance. That phrase, transform our world completely, that gets flagged as maybe signaling a level of control, of intervention, that isn't being spelled out.
That's a really key point. So the idealism itself becomes suspect for some. What exactly are they worried might be hiding behind that shiny facade? It feels like the goals are so broad, so universally positive that it makes them almost impossible to argue against in public. I mean, if you push back against ending poverty or protecting the planet, you look pretty bad.
Right. Gives the agenda a kind of protective shield. A very shiny cover, as you say.
So despite this very rosy picture painted by the official narratives, these 2030 plans, especially the UN agenda, they do face real skepticism. And not just from individuals online, but from academics, from institutions. This kind of paves the way for those more pessimistic interpretations we've touched on.
Yeah, and some fascinating critiques come directly from academic institutions. One area they focus on is what they term a global paradox. They argue that presenting the SDGs as these universal goals kind of glosses over the fact that challenges like poverty or pollution look very different from one country to another. So talking about humanity as one unified group with a single mission, they worry it leads to these one-size-fits-all solutions that just don't work locally. And the use of "we" throughout the UN documents. Some academics suggest that feels more like global leaders imposing an agenda rather than reflecting a genuine collective will, almost turning it into a kind of global law instead of a true partnership.
Interesting critique of the language and framing. What else? I think you mentioned concerns about hidden policies.
Exactly. The second point is this concern about how these policies, maybe unintentionally or maybe not, could actually reinforce existing power structures. There's one critic, Adam Sand, who argues that the SDGs might end up strengthening the legitimacy of the current international liberal economic system, basically advancing capitalist interests more than truly solving the problems they claim to address. He points to the fact that the goals aren't legally binding. He suggests that makes them a kind of gateway, a way to introduce other, perhaps unstated, objectives.
So, like, using these vague, positive slogans allows hidden powers to manipulate things behind the scenes.
That's the essence of the argument, yes. Adopt these broad, unrestricted slogans, and it potentially opens the door for manipulation and control.
Okay, and there was a third point from the academics.
Yes. The third major concern revolves around implementation failures and, frankly, unfulfilled promises. We're years into the 2030 agenda now, and report after report shows progress is way below expectations. Even the UN Secretary General himself admitted, they're not even 30% of the way there, halfway to the 2030 deadline. They might need until 2050. And yet, 2030 is still the declared year. The deadline hasn't officially shifted. So for some critics, this implies that the power to implement these changes remains even if the promised benefits aren't materializing, which, they argue, points towards a steady march towards absolute control within a single world system.
And many American institutions, academies, they seem to view this whole announced agenda as basically just a blueprint for a single world government. It aligns pretty neatly with that whole New World Order concept, which now often gets called the Great Reset. The idea being you dismantle existing financial, social, educational systems and move towards one unified sovereign system governing everyone. And proponents of this view would say, just look around you. Isn't this kind of restructuring already happening in many countries today? Okay, so let's bring this down to earth a bit. What does all this potentially mean for you, for me, for our daily lives? The information we've looked at highlights several potential hidden objectives that critics worry about with the 2030 agenda. Some academics believe that actually implementing this agenda requires international commitments that override local policies. This could potentially strip power away from national governments through direct intervention in their decisions, raising that big concern again. Are global governance slogans just a backdoor way to bring in a one world system?
And that prompts a really vital question for researchers looking into this. They worry that specific parts of the 2030 agenda, particularly those about changing lifestyles, how we produce things, how we consume, that these might be used as cover for imposing really deep societal transformations. Take something like the 15-minute city concept. On the surface, it sounds great, right? Local living, efficiency. But globally, critics worry it could morph into these enclosed, movement-restricted urban zones, all under the banner of cutting carbon emissions, essentially potentially confining communities into regulated areas, a bit like models seen in places like China.
And this next point. This really gets into some of the deeper anxieties. Initiatives like the Great Reset, pushed by the World Economic Forum. These have definitely sparked academic debate about power and wealth potentially becoming even more concentrated in the hands of international bodies and huge corporations, all supposedly justified by the need to restructure the global economy after the pandemic. And some critics even provocatively ask, why did the pandemic appear and then disappear, implying it might have served this restructuring purpose.
It's a very controversial suggestion, of course.
Absolutely. But the core concern is that this focus could weaken, maybe even dissolve, the power of individual nations into one single global system. Meaning, basically, all global economies could end up controlled by one entity under this 2030 framework.
What's also really striking here is the level of academic concern about digital technology. Specifically, its expanding role in managing our daily lives and the economy. We're talking about things like phasing out physical cash for electronic currency, CBDCs, for instance, implementing social credit systems, using sophisticated surveillance tech. The worry is, without really strong, transparent laws protecting individual freedom, these tools could easily become instruments of widespread social control. Think about it. Electronic money could potentially show everyone's balance globally. And if someone steps out of line, could their funds just be frozen automatically?
Wow. The implications for just basic individual autonomy are huge there. It makes you wonder, does this agenda, or at least the concerns about it, echo things we've seen before? Haven't similar grand plans or visions been proposed in the past, often in these big international forums?
Yes, absolutely.
These forums, they often have this outward appearance, right? Brotherhood, equality, justice, enlightenment, progress, all very positive. Yet the argument often is the actual results or hidden goals end up being the complete opposite. We see the potential for that today, don't we? These glittering declarations might just be concealing future objectives.
It's an interesting historical parallel to draw. Think back to the Middle Ages. You'd sometimes see aristocracy making a big public show of feeding slaves well, right out in front of everyone. Why? Well, partly to gain public favor, get compliance. It allowed their less obvious schemes to go unnoticed. People focused on the public treatment of the slaves, not the fundamental fact of their enslavement. And today, well, many of the world's wealthiest people run huge charitable organizations, often seen as a shield, right? Protection against accusations or suspicion. But observers who look closely might argue these are also strategic investments, ways to gain more influence with the public. The idea of slavery today, this perspective suggests, isn't about rags and chains. It's maybe more subtle. It's about neckties, job titles, loans, debt traps, all executed in this deceptive, sometimes even humanitarian style.
So quite a journey we've taken there. We've really dug into the different layers of understanding around this year, 2030. On the one hand, yes, it's presented as this beacon of hope, global cooperation for a better future, driven by these really noble goals, ending poverty, saving the planet. But then, on the other hand, we've explored these critical views, perspectives suggesting it might be part of a much, much larger plan, a 300-year vision maybe, culminating in what some are now calling the Great Reset, potentially a path towards a one-world system with consolidated power and maybe widespread control.
Which really leaves an important question for you, the listener, doesn't it? How do these two very different narratives sit with you? When you hear about global goals, future plans, 2030 agendas, try to consider the different lenses you can view them through. What jumps out at you when you hold these contrasting perspectives side by side?
It is definitely a lot to chew on, isn't it? Whether you ultimately see 2030 as, a genuine blueprint for a brighter future, Or maybe the starting gun for a new kind of global order. The sheer scale of the vision is just undeniable. We really hope this deep dive has given you plenty to think about. And for more in-depth explorations just like this one, please do remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's called Obscura Files. You really won't want to miss our next deep dive into the hidden truths and surprising facts that are shaping our world. Until then, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and stay well informed.